In 1958, a young prisoner sat in his cell in San Quentin, meticulously planning his escape. Every night, he'd sketch out detailed plans, studying guard rotations and fence patterns. But one afternoon, as Johnny Cash's deep baritone echoed through the prison yard during a special performance, something unexpected happened. Something that made this prisoner tear up those escape plans forever. Merle Haggard would later say that moment didn't just change his life, it saved it. But how did a teenage boy from Bakersfield end up plotting prison breaks in one of America's most notorious prisons? The concrete walls of San Quentin aren't meant to inspire music. They're designed to crush spirits, to remind men they're nothing more than numbers. Cell 33, Building C, was Merle Haggard's home in 1957. Every morning he'd wake up to see the death chamber just across from his cell block, the same death chamber where Caryl Chessman, the infamous Red Light Bandit, would later meet his fate. At just 20 years old, serving time for burglary, he faced a possible 20-year sentence. His cellmate was on death row, and their conversations often drifted to what it meant to know your last day was coming. But even in this darkness, Merle had something that set him apart. When lights went out in San Quentin, his voice would drift through the cell block, carrying Lefty Frizzle songs that made even the hardest convicts stop and listen. The guards would usually let him sing. It kept the peace better than any lockdown could. San Quentin had its own world order. Armed robbers were the aristocracy of crime, while petty thieves scraped the bottom. Yet Haggard, despite his relatively minor offense, commanded respect. By day, he worked the textile mill. By night, he ran the prison's gambling operations, a position that put him one shank away from death. The prison yard was where reputations were made and broken. Haggard learned to navigate its unwritten rules with a combination of wit and nerve. One particular guard, a man named Jones, saw something in young Merle. He'd sometimes let him practice in the prison chapel when no one was around. The acoustics in that chapel, Haggard would later say, were better than any recording studio he'd ever worked in. It was there, surrounded by empty pews and barred windows, that he started writing his first songs. Life in San Quentin followed a ruthless routine. Wake-up call at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30, work detail by 7. The mill itself was a pressure cooker of tensions, racial divisions, gang rivalries, and the ever-present threat of violence made every shift feel like walking through a minefield. Between shifts, he'd pore over books about music theory in the prison library, teaching himself to read notes and understand chord progressions. During those years, Merle witnessed his first prison murder. A man stabbed 16 times in the shower block. That image would later fuel some of country music's most haunting lyrics. The victim had been a friend, someone who'd shared coffee with Merle just that morning. The killing was over a $2 debt. In San Quentin, life was cheap, but pride was priceless. As his reputation as a musician grew, so did the requests. Inmates would pass notes asking him to sing for their loved ones during visiting hours. Guards would ask him to perform at the staff Christmas party. Even the warden, a notoriously harsh man, once stopped by his cell to hear him sing in the garden. Music gave him a kind of diplomatic immunity in a place where one wrong word could be fatal. Word spread through the prison grapevine, Johnny Cash was coming to perform. For Merle, who'd grown up idolizing Cash, this was more than just a concert. It was a glimpse of another life, a reminder that music could be more than just a way to pass time in prison. The old-timers had a saying in San Quentin: prison either makes you or breaks you. For Merle Haggard, those steel bars and concrete walls were forging something unique. A voice that would later tell the stories of the forgotten, the condemned, and the redeemed. Yet the seeds of this authenticity were planted long before San Quentin's walls cast their shadow over Merle's life. Back in Bakersfield, in a converted railroad boxcar, a 9-year-old boy was already learning life's hardest lessons. The same boxcar where his father's last words would change the course of his life forever. That converted boxcar sitting on the outskirts of Bakersfield wasn't much to look at, but for young Merle Haggard, it was a palace built from his father's dreams. James Haggard had brought his family west during the Dust Bowl, like thousands of other Okies fleeing the dying heartland. With $40 in his pocket and a pregnant wife, he'd turned that abandoned Santa Fe railroad car into a home, even adding a small bedroom when Merle was born in 1937. The boxcar sat in the shadow of the Santa Fe rail line, where freight trains would thunder past day and night. Those train whistles became young Merle's first music lessons, their mournful calls mixing with the Dust Bowl ballads his mother would sing while hanging laundry. But it was his father's guitar, a beat-up Gibson that James would play after long days working for the railroad, that truly captured Merle's imagination. James Haggard was more than just a railroad worker. He was a fiddle player who could make that Gibson sing like a choir. Every Saturday night, neighbors would gather in the cramped boxcar, pushing furniture against the walls to make room for dancing. The walls would shake with boot stomps and laughter as James played the old songs from Oklahoma, keeping their heritage alive in this strange California land. But life had other plans. When Merle was 9, his father suffered a stroke. The boy would spend hours by his hospital bed, watching helplessly as the man who'd built their world from nothing slipped away. Before he died, James whispered something to Merle that would haunt him for decades. "Be somebody, son. Make something of yourself." Those words echoed through the boxcar's empty rooms in the months that followed. Merle's mother, Flossie, took a bookkeeping job to keep food on the table, leaving young Merle alone with his father's guitar and those endless freight trains rolling past. He taught himself to play by listening to country radio, his small fingers stretching to form chords he didn't yet know the names of. Bakersfield in the 1940s was a town of contradictions. Oil derricks dotted the landscape like mechanical giants, while dusty farms struggled to survive in the California heat. The town was filled with transplanted Okies, Arkies, and Texans, proud people who'd rather work themselves to death than accept charity. Their music wasn't the polished sound of Nashville, it was something harder, born from calloused hands and broken dreams. Young Merle found himself drawn to the rougher side of town, where honky-tonks blazed with neon and live music spilled onto the streets. By 12, he was sneaking into bars to watch singers like Lefty Frizzell and Bob Wills, studying their every move. The local police knew him by name, not for any trouble, but because they'd find him asleep in doorways after the bars closed, having spent all night watching the musicians. The Gibson guitar became more than just an instrument. It was his inheritance, his father's final gift. Merle would often climb onto the boxcar's roof with it, playing until his fingers bled while watching the sunset paint the oil derricks in shades of gold and crimson. The other kids in the neighborhood would gather below, tossing pennies up at him for song requests. It wasn't much, but it was his first taste of performing for an audience. By 13, Merle had already mastered his father's old Gibson and was experimenting with different styles. He could play Western swing like Bob Wills, honky-tonk like Lefty Frizzell, and blues like Jimmy Rogers. But it was when he started writing his own songs that something truly special emerged. His first composition, written at 14, was about his father's death, though he wouldn't have the courage to perform it publicly for many years. But before Merle Haggard would become the poet of the common man, he'd first have to become something else entirely, a fugitive with a growing list of warrants and a dangerous taste for the outlaw life. The same trains that had lulled him to sleep as a child were about to carry him into a darkness that would either destroy him or forge him into country music's most authentic voice. The first time Merle Haggard ran from the law, he was barely 15. With nothing but his father's Gibson guitar and a pocket full of stolen cash from a local diner, he hopped a freight train heading north. He'd watch the bulls, railroad police, making their rounds for weeks, learning their patterns. That knowledge, combined with the agility of youth, made him a natural at train hopping. Juvenile detention centers became his second home. The Fred C. Nels Youth Correctional Facility in Whittier saw him 3 times before his 16th birthday. Each time, he'd escape. The guards called him rubber legs for his ability to slip away during work details. But it wasn't just physical escapes. Merle found another way out through the prison music program, forming his first band behind bars. Between escapes, he'd return to Bakersfield, where his reputation was growing in 2 distinct directions. In the honky-tonks, he was known as the kid with the golden voice who could imitate Lefty Frizzell better than Lefty himself. In police precincts, he was becoming known as a habitual offender, shoplifting, writing bad checks, and stealing cars for joyrides. His mother, Flossie, watched helplessly as her son seemed determined to destroy himself. She'd visit him in juvenile hall, bringing homemade cookies and news from home. "Your daddy wouldn't want this for you," she'd say. But the mention of his father only seemed to drive Merle deeper into rebellion. The ghost of those final words, "Be somebody," haunted him in every cell. The turning point came in 1957, when what should have been a routine robbery went wrong. Merle and 2 friends tried to break into a restaurant after hours, not realizing the owner was sleeping inside. Local authorities had had enough. Despite his youth and his mother's tearful pleas, they decided to make an example of him. The judge, reading through Merle's lengthy juvenile record, sentenced him to San Quentin. Behind San Quentin's walls, Merle couldn't stop running. He accumulated more infractions in his first year than some inmates did in 10. Brewing Pruno, prison wine, running gambling operations, planning escapes, anything to keep that feeling of rebellion alive. Prison psychiatrists noted his persistent antisocial behavior, but what they missed was the music that kept pouring out of him. Even in solitary confinement, Merle would compose songs in his head, singing them quietly to himself in the darkness. Fellow inmates started calling him country, both for his music and his refusal to fully embrace the convict code. He'd fight if pushed, but preferred to stay on the edges of prison politics, watching and learning. This observer's perspective would later give his prison songs an authenticity that no other country artist could match. His mother's letters arrived like clockwork, each ending the same way. "Your talent is a gift from God. Don't waste it here." But the criminal life wasn't done with him yet. A fellow inmate approached him with a plan for what promised to be the biggest escape attempt in San Quentin's history. The plan was solid. They had outside help, detailed blueprints, and a foolproof getaway strategy. All they needed was someone who could charm the guards, someone with a reputation for music rather than violence. He needed Merle. The choice he made in that moment would change not just his life, the entire landscape of country music. But first, he had to survive one final test, a test that would determine whether Merle Haggard would leave San Quentin in a coffin or with a guitar in his hands. The answer would come from an unexpected source, arriving on stage in a black suit with a guitar slung low across his hips. February 1958, the mess hall of San Quentin prison had been transformed into a makeshift concert venue. Johnny Cash stood on stage, his presence commanding even in this crowd of hardened convicts. Among them sat Merle Haggard, just hours after turning down what could have been the largest prison break in San Quentin's history. Cash didn't know that his audience included a former escape artist who'd spent the previous night wrestling with the biggest decision of his life. As the first chords of Folsom Prison Blues rang out, Haggard watched something he'd never seen before. Guards and inmates momentarily united by music. The man in black sang about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die, and every convict in that room felt understood. But it wasn't just Cash's performance that struck Haggard. It was what happened between songs. Cash spoke to them not as inmates, but as men. He talked about his own battles with drugs, his arrests, his demons. Then he said something that pierced Haggard's hardened exterior. "You can do better. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future." For a man who'd spent years running, these words hit like a thunderbolt. Haggard had built his identity around being an outlaw, wearing his crimes like badges of honor. But watching Cash command respect without violence, without schemes, without running, cracked something in his carefully constructed prison persona. The very next day, Haggard did something unprecedented. He reported to his prison job on time. The guards were suspicious. The other inmates watched carefully. Change in prison was often seen as weakness, but there was nothing weak about what was happening to Merle. He started spending his free time in the prison library instead of the yard, trading poker games for poetry books. The prison band became his salvation. Instead of planning escapes, he planned set lists. Late at night in his cell, Haggard began writing songs that would later become country classics. "Sing Me Back Home" was born from watching a fellow inmate's last walk to the death chamber. "Mama Tried" emerged from letters his mother sent, each one filled with love and heartbreak. These weren't just songs, they were testimony from a world few people ever saw and lived to sing about. His newfound discipline caught the attention of Cotton, a lifer who ran the prison's music program. Cotton had played with some of the biggest jazz bands of the 1940s before a heroin habit landed him in San Quentin. "You ain't writing songs," Cotton would tell him. "You're writing life." Those late-night music sessions in the prison chapel became Haggard's real rehabilitation. Not everyone celebrated Haggard's transformation. Some inmates saw his change as betrayal, a rejection of the convict code. They tested him with small provocations, stealing his commissary items, shouldering him in the yard. The old Merle would have responded with fists. The new Merle responded with something more powerful: indifference. This wasn't surrender, it was strategy. On his last night in San Quentin, Haggard performed for the inmates. His set list included every style he'd mastered: country, blues, gospel, and his own compositions. As he sang, he looked out at the sea of faces he'd come to know: lifers, short-timers, death row inmates, and realized he wasn't just singing for them. He was singing for his past self, the angry young man who'd entered these gates 3 years earlier. But the real test of his transformation wouldn't come behind prison walls. It would come in the unforgiving spotlight of country music's biggest stages, where authenticity could make or break a man faster than any prison shank. San Quentin had taught him how to survive, but now he needed to learn how to live. I write from experience. Those 4 words, spoken in a 1980 interview, summed up why Merle Haggard connected so deeply with working-class America. While other country stars sang about factory workers and farmers, Haggard had actually worked those jobs. Before prison, after prison, he lived the life his audience was living. During the recession of the mid-1970s, Haggard's music took on new urgency. Working Man Blues wasn't just a song, it was a news bulletin from the front lines of economic hardship. His influence spread beyond music, with labor unions using his songs at rallies and politicians quoting his lyrics in speeches. But Merle remained skeptical of anyone claiming to speak for the working class. Most people talking about hard work, he'd say, are wearing soft shoes. By now, Haggard's concerts had become something like religious revivals for the working class. People would drive hundreds of miles, spending their last dollars on tickets. They came not just for music, but for validation. Here was someone who understood their lives, their struggles, their pride. The industry tried to update his sound, to make him more contemporary. Merle responded by recording a Bob Wills tribute album, then a Lefty Frizzell tribute, then pure bluegrass. He famously told one producer, "I'm not here to follow trends, I'm here to outlast them." San Quentin Prison, 1994. Merle Haggard stood on the same stage where Johnny Cash had performed 36 years earlier. The inmates watching him weren't born when he'd done time here. But when he sang Mama Tried, every one of them felt the weight of their own mother's tears. During soundcheck, he walked through his old cell block. Cell 33 was occupied now by a young man doing 10 years for robbery. Merle stopped, talked to him through the bars. "I sat where you're sitting," he said. "The difference between us is I decided to make something else of myself." He left his guitar pick with the inmate. The concert wasn't just a performance, it was a testimony. Between songs, Merle spoke about choices, about redemption, about the thin line between making it and breaking it. The guards who remembered him from his time inside stood silent, witnessing a miracle none of them had expected. Prisoner A45-200 had become one of country music's greatest legends. That day marked more than a return to San Quentin. It completed a circle that began with a scared teenager hearing Johnny Cash sing about prison blues. Now Haggard was the one offering hope to another generation of inmates, proving that a man's past doesn't have to dictate his future. Merle Haggard's legacy isn't just in his music, it's in every second chance given, every redemption story told, every mistake overcome. From death row to superstardom, he showed that it's not where you start that matters, it's where you decide to go. If you enjoyed this video, then you will definitely enjoy this next one.